He hired a widow to cook, but her baby's eyes stirred a kind of love he'd buried for years. Forever changed. Under the burning skies of Dodge Creek, Texas territory, the date was October 17, 1886, and the town wore a silence that felt heavier than gun smoke. Dust rolled across empty streets, shutters creaked against the autumn wind, and saloons stood waiting for boots that never came. It was the kind of quiet that carried whispers of danger, the kind that made men grip their holsters even when no one was near. On the edge of this forgotten town lived a man once feared across counties, a gunslinger who had laid down his weapon years ago. His name was spoken in hushed tones, though he no longer answered to it. Solitude was his only companion, and sorrow was his closest shadow. Each night he sat by a dying fire, haunted by the memory of a family he could not protect, of a love buried in the dust, believing his heart had turned to stone forever. On that same October evening when the wind carried secrets through the hollow streets, a wagon creaked into Dodge Creek, its wheels straining against the rough earth, and on the wooden seat sat a woman dressed in black, her veil thin yet her resolve carved deep in her face, while in her arms rested a child so small, his presence seemed like a fragile flame against the cold frontier air. Whispers rose instantly from doorways and shadowed porches, curious eyes studying the stranger. For a widow in these parts was not uncommon, but a widow who dared ride alone with a baby stirred rumors sharper than blades. Yet she never flinched, never looked away, as if the hardships of the trail had already burned away every trace of fear. By dusk she reached the ranch on the outskirts where men labored under fading light, and there, with a quiet nod, she offered her service as a cook, her voice calm but edged with something no one could measure, a strength carved by loss and survival. The ranch owner accepted, for food was scarce and strong hands were needed, and so she stepped into the kitchen with her infant tucked against her hip, filling the old wooden room with the steady rhythm of her movements, the scent of bread and stew replacing the bitter odor of tobacco and dust. The men noticed quickly. Her silence was not weakness but armor, and though they whispered in corners about where she came from and what tragedies forced her into black clothes, none dared question her directly, for there was an unspoken warning in her gaze that silenced even the boldest tongues. In the dim glow of lanterns her baby cooed softly, tiny fingers reaching for air as if searching for a world beyond grief. And though she never spoke of her past, it lingered in every careful gesture, every protective glance. And when the former gunslinger saw her for the first time across the yard, her figure framed by the fading sun, he felt a stirring in the hollow place of his chest where only ashes had remained for years, a reminder that life did not end with loss, but sometimes began again in the most unexpected arrivals. Yet he turned away quickly, unwilling to admit that a woman marked by sorrow and a child marked by innocence had pierced through the stone walls he had built around himself. Still, the sound of the baby's soft cry followed him into the dark like an echo of something he once held and failed to keep, an echo he could not silence no matter how far he walked from the flickering lights of that kitchen. That night when the supper bell rang and the ranch hands gathered around the long wooden table, the air was heavy with the smell of stew and bread. But for the gunslinger it was the sound of soft laughter, not from the men but from the child in the widow's arms, that made him lift his eyes, and as bowls scraped and spoons clattered, he caught sight of the baby staring directly at him, gaze steady and unblinking as if the child saw beyond the scarred face and weathered lines into something even he no longer believed existed. Those eyes were wide and clear, not yet touched by cruelty or violence, and though he had faced down men with pistols drawn and fury burning, never had he felt so disarmed, because the light inside that child's eyes struck him deeper than any bullet, awakening a warmth he had sworn was buried under years of dust and silence. He shifted in his chair, trying to look away. Yet every time he lifted his head those eyes found him again, as though the infant held a secret connection, a silent message meant only for him, and it unsettled him in ways he could not name, stirring memories of another time, of a gentle voice that once called his name, of a future he believed had died with the echo of gunfire. Across the table the widow noticed his unease, her hands moving with quiet grace as she cradled her son, and though she said nothing, her glance carried both caution and understanding, as if she sensed the fragile thread stretching between the hardened man and the innocent child. The room grew quieter, the laughter faded, and though no one else seemed to notice the silent exchange, he felt as though the entire ranch had stilled, leaving only the thrum of his heartbeat against the soft breath of the child. His throat tightened, and for the first time in years he tasted something other than bitterness, a sweetness so unfamiliar it frightened him more than violence ever had, for this warmth was dangerous. It threatened to pull him back into a world where trust existed, where loss could strike again, and yet he could not resist it. The pull was too strong, too human, and as the baby blinked slowly, head resting against his mother's shoulder, the gunslinger knew with a certainty that unsettled his very soul that this tiny gaze had found the last surviving ember in a heart he believed was nothing but cold ash. The night after that supper, when the lanterns flickered low and the ranch lay quiet beneath the pale Texas moon, riders appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes jagged against the stars, and with them came the kind of silence that warned of violence long before the first word was spoken. For everyone knew those shadows did not belong to travelers, but to men who thrived on fear. Whispers carried fast, ranch hands gathered nervously, and the gunslinger stood at the edge of the corral, his jaw tight as he recognized the posture of predators preparing to strike. Yet he felt the weight of eyes watching him from behind, the widow holding her child close, her expression steady, though her fingers clutched the blanket tight. And when the ranch foreman urged her to take the baby and hide, she refused, her voice calm but sharp as steel, declaring that she had found one safe place in this hard world, and she would not abandon it no matter who threatened to tear it away. Her defiance sent a tremor through him, for he saw in her the same fire he had once buried deep, the kind of fire that refuses to yield even when logic demands surrender, and it forced him to face the truth he had been running from. If he turned away now, if he let those riders break the walls of this fragile home, he would not only lose them, but also lose the last fragile ember those innocent eyes had sparked in him. The men muttered about drawing guns, about sending someone for help, but the distance was too great and time was too short. The riders were circling, their laughter cutting through the wind like knives, and every moment of hesitation drew them closer. His hand hovered near the weapon he swore he would never touch again, the cold iron that had shaped his past and stolen his future. And in that trembling instant he realized that his choice was no longer about survival, but about redemption. For hiding had kept him alive, but it had never allowed him to live, and the thought of those ruthless men tearing apart the only shred of hope left in this barren land was something he could not bear. He turned slowly, meeting the widow's eyes, and though she said nothing, the silent plea within them bound him tighter than any oath, for she was not asking for a savior, but for someone willing to stand when standing was hardest, and the weight of that trust steadied his trembling hand. The night grew colder, the riders drew nearer, and as he finally wrapped his fingers around the gun, he thought he had buried forever. The sound of metal clicking into place was not just the beginning of a fight, but the return of a man who had once sworn he was finished with this world, now forced to decide whether love, fragile as it was worth stepping back into the fire. When the riders thundered through the gates, their laughter turned to fury as the gunslinger stepped into the open yard, his shadow stretched long by the lantern's glow. And with every shot he fired, the night shook with echoes of a man reborn, steel meeting chaos until dust and smoke swallowed the screams. Yet when the silence returned, it was not victory he felt, but the weight of arms that were no longer empty. For the widow had rushed forward, her child pressed close, her eyes shining with a gratitude that carried no words, only truth. And in that moment he understood he had not drawn his weapon for survival alone, but for the fragile hope of love, for the chance to belong once more. Though tomorrow held uncertainty, and the road ahead would demand more battles than bullets could win, the ember in his chest now burned steady, for he had chosen to stand, and sometimes that choice is enough to heal even the deepest wounds.